Alright, good evening everyone. This is Rillian and Amara back with you for another Heart of Battle session with the 2MK group. As always, this content is being rebroadcast from the Amara2_MK channel to the main 2_MK channel with full permission. Today we're going to be working on identifying the minor status effects, as we currently call them, that you get placed on you during matches, especially in the bronze up to silver tier, and what you can do about them with various characters. Obviously we're working with Ryu because, one, this is the character Amara plays the most, and two, because he's very good for letting you see the vast range of effects that can be placed on and can be dealt with directly, because he has a lot of tools for getting out of them as well. So today it looks like we're going to start with a relatively low level Laura, and you have to recognize when you first start off that people who don't know too much about what they're doing are still susceptible to status effects, but it's much less relevant. They're more likely to resist them simply because they're not quite sure what's going on. You should generally play to your own strengths as much as you can until you recognize that a status effect is going one way or the other. And since characters like Laura don't tend to have a lot of status effects they can place on you, in fact, in all of the time I've observed Omni Rabbit playing this character, I've only really been sure that she could manage two of them. She has a lot of mix-ups, but the mix-ups themselves are just effectively one effect. Much like that. But there's a lot of nuance in what you can get your opponent to do and what you should be expecting them to do by doing certain things. For example, this player tends to approach almost all the time. And they also like to hit sweep. Amara, on the other hand, often responds to things by trying to get out of the corner a little bit more quickly than she sometimes needs to, and it can get her into some trouble. So the cornered effect is relatively strong against her. It's not specifically a status of Ryu. And befuddle happens when you are worried because of your own execution failing you in something. But again, at this level, most of what is going on is more so about the original things we taught, in terms of understanding whether or not the player's wish is to close in, to stay away from you in zone, to apply pressure. Those sorts of things are more important when you are below, let's say, 1,000 points. So this player's aim is to close in almost all the time. So you can give them a lot of time to do that. And it will most likely solve your problem. It's not even really necessary to throw fireballs at this particular player. Just give them long enough and they'll, as people love to say, hang themselves. You might need to fake it a little bit, but that's about it. But for those of you who don't specifically find this sort of thing interesting, to play as, however, I don't mean overall, There are other responses you could have to this person. For example, you could go for meaties on them after you've gotten the knockdown by making sure you get a knockdown with a good meaty. Lara doesn't have particularly good makeup, so you never know what you'll manage to get done. However, this is not Amara's style, so she's more likely to end up in these situations because her defense has to be perfect for longer, given that she's not generally aiming to stack up the damage as much as she can.
Final round. Fight.
However, as you can see, the Lara player is very much devoted to building up that pressure. And because Amara's responses don't tend to knock them far away enough to stop them, they'll keep at it for a while. In order to do this, she would have to practice something very much more difficult. And as a result of that, while the Lara player is not specifically slowing her, she does end up slowed because of the relative difficulty of the form of fireball game that needs to be used to keep this sort of player away from you. There's a very specific spacing that it requires. But this is the way that it happens for everyone. If you've determined to play a particular style, sometimes it may take your wins away from you because you are not comfortable with or willing to shift the way you're playing in order to supposedly get more points. We're using Nashbot at the moment, mostly for warm-ups. And to practice a certain combo that is needed for some higher level punishes against some lesser seen characters. Nashbot is currently available on our site. -mk.org, our most recent bot release. So Mara's working on this relatively harder cancel in the meantime. A lot of your game plan in terms of statuses is going to be based around whether or not you can get the opposing character to do something that is against their best interest. It doesn't specifically matter what the status effect you manage to get on them is, only that it has some such effect on them based on their character. You can always add effects to people that won't necessarily do the maximum amount of damage to them, or disrupt their game plan too much if that's just the natural one that you add, but you should recognize that it may require a bit more finesse to use that to your advantage, and often quite a lot more execution or patience to actually use it. Amara's current work with Ryu is actually a fairly good example of that. She has a very strong ability to make the opponent worry too much about their offense and try to get into situations where they're either pushing really hard on the offense to try to open her up, or they're feeling uncomfortable about offense as an entirety and looking for a moment where she's made a mistake. It's relatively easy to make use of both sides of this. The first way to do it is when they get too aggressive, especially if they have moves that are probably -4, and that's what she's working on now, using her stand light kick into Tatsu combo to punish people who end up in that sort of frenzy situation. But here's the opposite situation. The problem with Chun-Li's matchup is that Chun-Li is, in this game, mostly weak to zoning. She can't get in on Ryu very easily. She has some good jump arcs if you're not expecting it, or if your fireball timing is relatively predictable, but mostly she can't do anything. So even the fact that Amara is occasionally dealing with the Rankyaku spacing doesn't really mean that she has to worry too much about it, because eventually she's just going to recognize this is the problem, this is where my timing is off, I'm going to fix the timing, and then the opponent really won't have an answer anymore. Now that was an example of Chun-Li's strongest status effect. Chun-Li does not so much have Befuddle as she has Blind. She's very good at keeping you in a situation where you don't really know what you're looking at, because her moves tend to look similar, her spacings tend to look different. She's seeking to make you confused, but not truly confused. You're not feeling this stage of not knowing what Chun-Li can do, or even of knowing what she will do, but rather that you see her do something and misinterpret what it is she actually is doing. She also has a lot of evasive hitboxes and ranges that would bring you to one conclusion over another for no real reason. Once she's done that enough, you tend to forget things like, should I punish this? Can I punish this? Because she can make a lot of things not quite safe, but close to that. And it can become a real problem. A character with a lot of moves tends to have Blind as an option, simply because they have too many different ways of making you worry about spacings, about timings, and about what you are seeing. This is not the same as worrying about what will happen, because in the case of worrying about what will happen, if you thought to yourself for a moment that you could react perfectly, if you could freeze frame for just a little bit longer and recognize, okay, I know this spacing, my opponent can only do one thing from this spacing, so I'm going to get ready for that one thing, then you'd be in a great situation, but that is not what Chun-Li does. Chun-Li specializes in making you think one thing and another thing happening visually. In fact, it can be relatively straining to fight Chun-Li players for a long time, because even in many cases her costume helps with this prospect. In this stage, for example, pink on this background, pink and white on this background. This is almost a psychological trick. I should take it up.
Round 2.
So mostly keeping her in a space has a lot to do with understanding when she wants to jump and when she is seeking to set up an ambiguous jump, like that one. and when she's not doing that, when she's not close enough for that, and when you should just throw the fireball. Now, there is obviously a way out of this, otherwise she would be a character who could never really get in, period. But it uses up her meter, so it's not really a big deal. The key to this is recognizing when you shouldn't respond to her jump because she won't reach you. And because her jump is so different from that of other characters, it can be fairly misleading, and somewhat annoying really. But Chun-Li players are counting on that being locked. It's a double-edged sword in that if she had a better jump arc, she'd be more predictable, but also probably more capable of doing certain types of pressure. So that space right there is what she has the Hadouken for, the Kikoken for, to make you generally worry about things. But mostly once she's out of range of actually hitting you with certain buttons on the ground, unless the player is very good at footsies, you really shouldn't do anything. Because eventually she will make something go wrong in some direction. And then when she's far enough away, just throw the fireball. There's more to it than that, since obviously there are players who know how to use those situations to set you up for things like going through your fireball with her super, or just sliding under your moves. As I said, she can be very evasive. But you're mostly worried about the blind. She's aiming to cause you to misjudge the situation or the range, using her quick speed, the specifics of her animations, and so on. Nash is a different type of fighter in that regard. Nash is basically better at slowing you. Nash is better at slowing you because you often feel as if you should respond to things Nash does. You know that if you could respond to them, you'd be better off because they're not usually like that. They're not often that fast. But once they hit you, they're often more safe. So a lot of the time you're aiming to make sure that Nash isn't actually hitting you, that you've stopped him before he hit you. But this sort of reactive play slows people down, especially people who don't have their own counter zoning tools. Nash can put you in a space where he makes you feel as if you must deal with him. You must be ready for Moonsault or Knee Bullet or any number of those things he does. And then he'll just continue to throw sonic booms until you get tired of that. Then attempt to catch you off guard, frustrate you a little bit, and start over. Alternately, you go into what we are calling Frenzy because you just are so tired of getting hit by or having to block sonic booms, and he gets knocked you out of the air with something else. This is why he's not allowed, game design-wise, to be good at pressure too.
Fight!
Akuma, on the other hand, is relatively straightforward in terms of status effect style things. He can more or less either zone you, or not. The Ryu matchup has a bunch of complicated, specific interactions to deal with here, but for the most part, Akuma himself is not a really strong character in terms of putting status effects on people. He can do a little bit of everything though, which is really good for adapting around people who seem to be particularly weak to one or the other. For example, here we have the option of just, okay, well, I want to slow you now. I'm just going to stand here and throw fireballs instead. And once he's slowed you enough, he can get you into the concept of this is what the fight's going to be right now. But once he reverses that, then you can be caught off guard. And because Akuma is such a good character at doing damage, him catching you off guard is a really important thing for him. It's why people who like to frustrate others as, you know, just their general frustration style, tend to be quite good at this character. You can be good at Akuma through pure technical, raw skill, or you can be good at Akuma because you know how to get under your opponent's skin. And generally don't have the same problem. But as you can see, if you are facing someone who is whose buttons are hard to push, Akuma doesn't really have a lot he can do, and then once he does get cornered, you mostly just have to be patient. He will mess himself up eventually, you just have to figure out how he's going to do that. Fighting his way out of the corner is a difficult thing for this character. He can do a lot of things, but none of them specifically stop the scenario he's in. All of his really good escapes are also really, really telegraphed, and with just decent reactions and the fact that once you are out of his main attack range, you don't really have to worry about anything, you could just down back and wait. It means that often Akuma's only way out of the corner is to dash throw you, and if you can react to that too, For Akuma players, I strongly suggest you to have that actually be your default. Just stay there for a while, hang out, maybe neutral jump to make people think you're going to do something else. And then just dash up throw, and if they attack it, you can live with that. It's better than attempting to jump out or struggling to find the correct button to hit and then failing terribly. Now, Akuma will actually give us a very special form of blind that isn't seen against most other characters. There's a specific range that if Akuma stands at that range, Akuma players have a tendency to jump even though it would not reach. But because of the way Akuma's buttons work, you often have the capacity to jump at the same time as Akuma if your character also has a decent jump arc. And once you're there, it will usually act as a cross-up if you have a cross-up. A good cross-up button, medium or something, will usually cause that to work out. Well, unfortunately, it looks like we're not going to get to see that particularly. But doesn't look like anything's overall wrong with Street Fighter itself or the stream, so looks like we're heading back to Nash. Nash's other strength doesn't really come up against Ryu specifically. Nash is a good character for making people stressed out about doing their counter zoning pressure and then punishing them for trying to counter zone. This doesn't really work well on Ryu. It doesn't work particularly well on Ken either. I don't think it's going to work too well on Menat, but many of the other characters in the game have to deal with it because of all the weird little idiosyncrasies of Nash's sonic boom pressure, his ability to get behind you if you try to counter zone once he has V-trigger, and so on. And since he can set up quite a lot of damage once he's in, or even dash behind sonic booms in very specific timing, the thing that's holding the character back most of all, I would say, from my very limited experience in trying to do certain things with him, is more so that too many of his tools are linear, and therefore he relies too much on slowing you. Since most of the game is about setting up your moonsault so you can get in and apply pressure, you have to really be sure of how you want to apply that pressure. because throwing people is probably something you have to care about. Unfortunately, Nash's buttons are only so good, and his moonsaults are not usually plus enough that just immediately going for the throw is a good idea for most people. Still, he does have a lot of good punishes, and baiting people into doing things is a truly meaningful perspective here. So here we have an Akuma who seems to be interested in zoning. But even so, you'll know that Akuma players do still tend to keep on coming on in. This one is a little bit different. They seem to have a bit more control over their flow, but it's not necessarily going to help because Akuma zones other characters. The entire reason why the Akuma Ryu matchup is basically even, if not in Ryu's favor at least slightly, is that Ryu is so hard to zone. Probably the only character who can truly keep up with him is Urien. Guile has a way, and it's really complicated, but if the Ryu player knows what they're doing, it's harder to force Guile to not. It's harder for Guile to force Ryu to not do that thing than the opposite. So at the end of the day, we're seeing a lot of zoning because, again, you must remember that what comes first is the player's tendency. And this player is 100% still a zoner, Akuma or not. They want to be away, they want to jump in from the longest range they can manage, they want to hit with clipping things and make sure that they don't end up at disadvantage. But there we see the problem. Eventually, zoning Akuma corners himself. And depending on how you know what to do about that, that can be a problem for you. This, for example, is a situation in which they want to parry, but Amara can just beat this by either timing the fireball correctly or activating tree trigger and finishing them off. And that was the blind moment I talked about, where you both jump, but the Akuma player is not expecting you to jump and usually do nothing or to hit something late, so you end up on opposite sides of each other.
You're close to a rank up.
So let's go back to talking status effects if this person does in fact rematch. Unfortunately, Amara has a tendency that when she beats certain people in particular ways, I'm not sure if they get discouraged, but they somehow seem to recognize that it's not going to happen. There's nothing they can specifically do to change what just happened. So they get less rematches. And as usual, I remind that we're playing ranked for Art of Battle because people play a bit more quote-unquote seriously, and often when you defeat people of higher rank, they're less likely to either rematch or just play calmly. When you beat someone with a higher rank than you in rank and they give you the rematch, they're probably likely to pull out all the stops.
Another fight is coming your way.
Unfortunately, Capcom still has not updated this to show us ping or relative latency. We just have to settle for bars. I can see why, given that it would probably be difficult to explain to people why certain numbers are bad, and it could lead to some really annoying situations, but I'm not sure what this is going to be overall. From here to France is generally borderline. You'll get enough lag to make it frustrating, but not enough lag that you really think this is unfair. On the other hand, sometimes it's just clean and you're okay. So I'm not yet willing to say this is terrible, especially given the two specific types of interaction you get with the Netflix. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Zagatis, it was basically like a telegraph for a zoning Ryu to begin with. It was unnecessary to even check whether or not they were going to be a zoning Ryu, but that's something only Slayers fans will know. Well, we hope it's not too laggy on their side because it's not remotely laggy on ours, but one-sided rollback is a thing. I guess we'll know from the rematch regardless of how it works. But yes, as I said, it's so likely that they're just going to zone that anything less than that is probably just going to be a result of the opponent feeling cornered.
Round 2.
Status effects are just a way to modify your understanding of things so that behaviors that seem against the main thing you understand about a player don't take you too by surprise. I don't mean in the sense that you should be able to defend from them. The game would be kind of boring if everyone was really predictable, but it helps to prevent you from misclassifying people or getting frustrated as much, because you're able to see what caused the thing in question to happen. It's easier to understand what makes this sort of person jump, and therefore deal with that, even though the argument was, oh, this is a zoner. Yeah. But in order to zone actively, they have to do a certain set of things, and they have to recognize they shouldn't get cornered. So every now and again they'll jump forwards so that they don't get cornered. But once you note they've got out of that situation, and are no longer at risk of being cornered, that's the only situation in which they'll jump. They've already jumped back, they were expecting to be able to jump forward and get a Hadouken, so it's not really strange. So this player doesn't want to be cornered, but they can't exactly do a whole ton about it. So once they do get cornered, the situation gets frantic for them, and you don't really have to worry too much about that from there. But you should still be expecting all the medium kick and heavy kick jump-ins, and the large fireball war, and all of those things. So now their meter is completely gone, and even had Amara not done that, she would have just probably sped up and defeated them some other way, given the range that they wanted to stand at. So we're going to see if we get the rematch here. If we don't, could be for any number of reasons, but I'd expect that it's lag from here to France. Oh, well, it was 5 bars, maybe it only dipped for a little bit.
Round 1. Fight.
And I know you all can't see it, but that appears to have resulted in a friend request of some kind. Might not be this player though, it might be a different one. But having Ryu to train against is probably interesting. So let's look at it the other way. It's easy to say, oh well, this is so easy, this person plays this way, this person plays this way, but they're actually playing quite well too in terms of the effects they are able to put onto Amara. The only thing stopping them from being extremely effective is a specific technique involving causing people to get up into Hadoukens in such a way that they can't do reversals or push it forward on you. But by alternating between basically just jumping forward and back and throwing Hadoukens, they're able to keep her on guard enough to stand at full range, like that. And once they are at full range, Tatsu is no longer specifically an effective method to get past those. So Amara's aim in this match is to not stand at the point where Tatsu's won't reach. And their aim in this match is to do stuff like that. Keep her on her toes enough, watching both the air and the ground, that she doesn't have enough time to watch her own spacing, and results in this sort of situation. Timing your fireballs is important.
You win.
Unfortunately, as we all know, it's kind of hard to deal with friend requests on stream, so let's hope that they are okay with it being accepted later or using some CFN version of that. So that status effect is what we refer to as confuse. Confuse is the opposite of the Chun-Li one. You're not aiming really to make sure that the person is in the right position, that they can't see you. The mental strain you're placing on them is in the mind. If you met someone who was really resistant to confuse, they would just ignore the fact that you were doing two different things and just always respond to a particular one, and usually ignore a bunch of damage. Like, there's no specific reason why one couldn't just hold down back and wait for your opponent to get frustrated. Especially on Ryu, who can mostly just parry the opponent's fireballs indefinitely. But that does open you up to other problems, such as your opponent attempting to find a different way in on you. But if your defense and reactions are really good, it's hard to confuse people like that. People who have very good reactions, or who don't need to move much in order to play, they don't feel uncomfortable, and they don't get uneasy, they're super resistant to it. These are the people that most likely, some people will say they can't be conditioned. Because it also tends to make them immune to the Lara effect of getting stressed out about stopping something Lara is doing because of it being relatively difficult to stop it in some way. That's the sort of person who will just remain calm through the entire thing, even if they guess wrong every time and get perfected. They'll just shrug it off and start the next round and assume it's not going to mean anything. When you meet those sorts of people, you normally have something to fall back on. The only character in this game I can think of that can really apply Confuse well, but doesn't have a backup, is Lara, and she has the advantage of there being so many good things she can do once close that she doesn't really need to manage to confuse you to get away with those things. She just has to have good enough defense when that's not happening that she doesn't get destroyed on her side. So far we know nothing about this Ryu. But they seem to be the type that likes to put on pressure for now. Of course, this sort of player is the type that finds it hardest to break Amara's guard in the long term. And adding the occasional Shoryuken for frustration is not going to help matters. But it's the ability to let go of things like that, of recognizing that you got hit with an EX Hadouken, so what?
Round two.
Or, in the cases of some people, to get angry. It's entirely possible to be the sort of player that can get angry and still not do this, which is what we were teaching in probably August. You can be angry, completely seeing red, enraged, but that's your normal state, so you're not on tilt even a little bit. Maybe your anger fuels your reactions and makes them faster. Maybe it helps your decision making. Maybe it makes you clearer on what you want to do. Any of those things is possible for a given player, which is actually why the idea of making an opponent angry only works if the opponent is the sort of player that actually messes up.
Final round. Fight.
So the main thing that this player is managing right now is similar to Confuse, but not strong enough. They do enough low attacks on defense to make you think they're the sort of person who uses them at other times, but they don't. It's hard to see that when you're like pushing, when you've been fighting all day and have a lot of stuff in your mind, but this is why having a coach or an analyst or a spotter is so useful. This player has basically never used a light attack as an actual pressure strike. And they haven't used it for anything serious either. They use them on defense and then they go pretty much all out all the rest of the time. So once you're able to subtract tracking that aspect of the game from yourself, it's fairly easy to move on from there.
You've got a 5-win streak.
At least where we stand right now, they have shown no sign of actually using a bunch of quick attacks to keep up actual pressure. Looks like no rematch on this either. So even though they were able to apply slow and attempt to apply confuse, their strength in applying confuse wasn't enough. It is something you can just dispel by recognition alone and not necessarily having to do anything or find a solution or see a pattern. In fact, one of the easiest ways to tell the difference between confuse and blind is based in that. If you're confused, but you suddenly realize a pattern, the confusion goes away. If you're blinded and you recognize a pattern, that doesn't mean anything, because the pattern that a person who is blinding you causes is a lot more to do with the buttons they're using, and you can't be sure of the range, because they're not even bothering to be sure of the range themselves.
You have a 5-win streak in a event.
The scallop fingers. Let us hope they live nearby or something. It would be somewhat fitting. But here we have a clash of two people with relatively high win streaks. May not seem that high, but a 3-win streak is enough to get you to the next round in the tournament, even a 3 or 5 one. So you can see here exactly how that situation works out. The opponent is attempting to zone. Amaro walks forward and parries occasionally while moving into a very specific place on the screen. If the opponent never moves between fireballs, it becomes easy to set up her own position. But they are now attempting to lure her into doing too many tatsus. In this situation, it's usually easier to just ignore the entire thing. But Ryu versus Ryu makes it difficult because if you activate your V-trigger, chances are your opponent is activating theirs as well. So you have to spend a lot more time at the beginning of the match just like parrying fireballs to get the advantage first. But you'll note that this person has full meter and is waiting for a chance to use that. So there may be some fireworks happening a little bit later on, regardless. Because you'll note that they're zoning, but they don't really seem interested in throwing EX fireballs. Even though a lot of what Amara is doing is based around specifically expecting them to throw regular ones. So I'm going to assume that they are holding on to that meter with the intention of using it when they can. But maybe they just haven't noticed it, but I wouldn't expect someone with a 3-win streak to have gotten it easily without like using meter for entire rounds at a time. You never know though. So technically they are at advantage because of that, and of course their own meter also being ready on the other side.
Final round.
This is a special type of status effect, in fact. Very few characters can actually achieve it, because most of them don't have a super that is so threatening and so multi-use as to cause you to get petrified. This is different from what we consider paralysis, because it is not about decision making. You're only worried about one thing. You know the thing. You're not paralyzed because you're not pushed to do a specific thing. You know you already have a solution. But that's precisely the problem. You are in danger and you have a solution to that danger, but the solution has a requirement. It requires that you stand in a very specific space and probably that you don't do anything. You're not terrified. You're literally petrified. You are being stoic and stony and waiting for a particular thing to happen. But some opponents can take advantage of that by making sure that particular thing never actually happens, but you spend all your time worried about it. And they went for something, rather than blocking. Oh well.
You win.
So now we get a chance to see if that's actually their style, maybe. Yes, looks like we have the rematch.
Round 1. Fight.
So until this player builds up enough meter to achieve that slow petrification effect, they're not so much at Amara's mercy, but they have to play a different way altogether. They have to be much more cautious and not giving away a lot. Amara in turn just has to space herself correctly most of the time. But they know that eventually she will run out of meter. And it puts them in the unfortunate situation where they both have the meter, but neither of them is specifically willing to activate it, because being the second one to activate it is usually a problem. So Amara ends up saving hers for a cancel, and I presume her opponent might be doing the same, or maybe they're just not as interested in using it until she does, because of their style. The other effect we've been seeing occasionally is the guard break effect. The guard break effect is mostly about hitting standing medium kick or some similarly long range button that for whatever reason on your particular character is not punishable. And then dashing in for a throw on the sort of person who gets worried about you doing something else. This doesn't normally work on other people because they have a lot of buttons and a lot of responses, but it works well on many less mobile Ryu players. This person, however, does not count under the less mobile Ryu player banner, so they haven't used it that much. They don't actually use it to try to break Amara's guard because the way she ends up playing is based mostly on spacing rather than flat out blocking style defense. So when fighting another Ryu, they don't often tend to get the impression that she is actually defensive unless they are extremely offensive. And this tends to lead to them not bothering to do the whole guard break thing because they figure they'll have a little bit more luck throwing fireballs or something similar. So it's with that understanding that you could interpret a player like that. They definitely wanted to zone for the most part. And they definitely recognized that zoning was not alone a way to overcome the opponent. But it's not specifically that they decided, okay, I should change my entire style now. It's more so that the status that they ended up in led itself toward a particular thing. Understanding how to use that type of information can be really important for your overall skill and comfort at this game. I'll say comfort. Because there's nothing worse than playing a game in which you spend a lot of time uncomfortable. That's probably one of the primary reasons why people get frustrated with fighting games. It doesn't really have to do with win or lose. People can have fun winning or losing. Some people are the type that can have fun losing constantly. But when they start to get uncomfortable and feeling as if the game doesn't make any sense, or that their opponent doesn't make any sense, could be either, it can become a frustrating experience. And you shouldn't let that happen to yourself as a general thing. There's usually just a lack of information, and when you go back and look at the matches, you'll feel much better. Honestly, most of the time, we look back at our matches and we recognize, oh, I could have made sense of all that if I had been thinking that way at the time. This is the at the time thinking that we're trying to learn now. So Rashid is one of the few characters that can do both blind and confuse, and he basically does them both at the same time all the time. That said, part of the reason why Rashid is so effective is if you don't know how to deal with his stuff. And shameless plug, you should go and check on 2-mk.org for Rashid bot, because if there was any bot that I would ever tell anyone, you have to use this bot to understand this game, it's Rashid bot. Because Rashid, the spacings for what you need to do to punish Rashid are so relatively different than every other character that understanding him as a whole can be really stressful. And the stress is what many Rashid players are counting on. Moments like that shouldn't really frustrate you. They should just be just floating back and forth. As you can see, even his V trigger is based around being confusing in that way. His V skill is based on being confusing, but there's not really much that Rashid does that isn't blind or confused in some way. But learning to keep him out can help. But honestly, he's not that easy to keep out either. So you get a little blind from that, and the understanding of, okay, which button is he going to hit? How is he going to use his buttons to change his hitboxes and frustrate me? But there are other things as well. Unfortunately for this opponent, breaking Amara's defense is still really hard. Looks like they got a little luck there though. But oh, a little short. It's of course sad to go for the kill and drop your kill combo, but it is how you learn to use EX meter to get kills. You'll hear it quite often on stream that people attempt to kill to manage to save the meter. Well, that feeling is the same feeling as attempting it and not managing. I wonder if this strangeness that we're getting reported from the team about the stream indicates that we have finally somehow gotten to the point where Twitch likes us and is like changing the stream and stuff. But whatever.
You are currently ranked Conqueror of the South End, North America.
So we've gotten to the person who is most likely to break the 8 reign streak, but not necessarily completely likely.
Round 1. Fight.
So, the Zangief matchup doesn't really require a lot of status effects in either direction. It's mostly about understanding when Ryu can throw fireballs and where Ryu needs to backdash to in order to keep throwing them. Anything aside from that is basically going to result in loss. There's a specific space Ryu has to stand at in order to safely throw them. And it often involves backdashing out of Zangief's stuff so that this doesn't happen. Controlling your fireball game is one part of it, and learning when to medium Tatsu because your opponent is just shutting down your fireball game is basically the other part. Now the reason this works is because, if you weren't aware, Zangief's jumping heavy kick is actually so slow in terms of startup that Ryu can throw a fireball and then usually parry it if Zangief jumped over the fireball on reaction. So you can backdash, you can get some space that way. If you expect the Zangief player to jump, then take your time and take out the parries, because the only button they can hit is the heavy kick, and the heavy kick will result in that. Now, the good thing about this matchup for Ryu is that getting cornered is not actually that scary. It's bad, but it's what puts you in the corner that mattered, and not so much the corner itself. The main thing you have to worry about in the corner is this. Because Zangief can pull a lot of weirdness on you with that.
You lose.
But again, this is also what should be considered in terms of understanding when your confuse is real, i.e. the character that you're playing is easily flustered by your opponent's options, and when it is you not understanding something you want to be able to do.
Round one. Fight.
Because here, there's really no reason to be too stressed about this matchup. But if one didn't know of the issue with his jumping heavy kicks, it would be easy to get stressed out about this matchup. If you got stressed out about getting hit by those, for example, it would be easy to get stressed out about this matchup. But as you can see, none of this has really dealt with anything other than a life lead happened. And then it went away. But it didn't go away and then turn into a terrible scenario. It turned into exactly what it normally turns into. Ryu and Zangief. It went right back to where it was. So generally this is Zangief's trump card, that's what he's aiming for. And Ryu is looking for the moment where he can activate V-Trigger safely, and either use it to keep himself safe from Zangief in some way, on a jump in let's say, or to throw more fireballs. But unfortunately, Mara doesn't get much practice with this matchup, so the spacings are still fairly foreign to her. And knowing when to deal with Zangief's back roll timing is much harder. So my original lack of confidence vote had more to do with unfamiliarity in the matchup than anything specific to either her general approach to Zangief or Zangief as a character. It's simply a matter of knowing how many of the options you have are able to solve your problems. There is something to be said for just like this. Because knowing when that's going to happen and when it's over and when you don't have to worry about it anymore changes this matchup quite a lot.
Final round. Fight.
So now we're looking for the Zangief to try to find the right moment to use their super. And it's going to be really difficult to keep out of their grip with that. Because as you can see, Zangief has a really strong anti-air game in the sense of being able to get you into certain situations. But there's a solution for you. So there's some good Zangief practice for the night. Zangief doesn't really cause much effect innately. He is mostly just muscle. He can cause some variants of Petrified, and is good at taking advantage of cornered if he can get you into cornered, because he tends to do so fairly easily. But if you're good at pushing him backward, it doesn't tend to be so bad. So about the Nash bot and Nash bot's specifics. Nash is also a good bot for when you're not looking to do anything specific. course your other option is to play the CPU, but you know, at least when you are facing Nash bot, you can actually see the inputs. I'm pretty sure that they've learned a long time ago not to show you the inputs when the CPU is playing. Because as you can see, Nash bot is mostly about making you recognize the differences between punishes and stopping yourself from autopiloting toward a certain punish too much. Every now and again we will still all do it, but it helps to have something to grind that particular feeling on rather than actually pushing yourself to do it in real matches, because it's kind of painful in real matches to do the wrong punish and lose.
You are currently ranked Conquest of the South End, North America.
So here we have a standard Mika coming in.
Round one.
And
Fight.
Mika's status effects are really specific, which is useful, but also she used to be able to do it better before. She's decent at blind because she can do a lot of things like this, just putting more pressure on you with light buttons than most people are willing to seriously deal with. She's also good at getting you to the corner, obviously, and at taking some advantage of that. But again, blind is not confused. Blind is about making people confused about your situation, about your frame data, about what you are actually looking at. And fortunately, Mika has a lot of moves that have variable ranges and a lot of active frames.
Round two. Fight.
And those are the two key things you need. When I say a lot, 4 or 5 will do. For example, it's fairly common for Mika players, especially in the early parts of the game, it was fairly common for them to think, this is how I'm going to deal with this situation because my opponent doesn't know that I'm actually plus. They think I'm minus and therefore they will die. Especially for people who go for really big punishes. It also lets her have something that's interesting to work out but not easily seen or understood by most people. Because of this particular setup, Mika has high defense. This high defense is based on the idea that you can't specifically do certain things to her. You have to use much quicker, less damaging options. By just using certain buttons, she is able to reduce the amount of damage that any given person can do. Now, if you have a good option that deals with her, it's usually only temporary, which makes the situation worse for you. Much like this. For example, this player could probably be stopped consistently enough every time, but it means that Amara must use a very specific form of anti-air in order to do this. Otherwise, this is just going to happen. So she can like dash forward, she can, in some weird situations, do sweep. But her standard responses, even though they don't necessarily result in her taking a ton of damage, it results in the Mika player taking pretty much no damage. They can keep this up for as long as they need to. And eventually, she'll wear you down, get one opening, and that's the end of that. And while fatigue is not specifically a status effect in itself, do note that I'm talking about the mental fatigue that being blinded for long periods of time causes you. Contrast this to Cammy, who, while it would seem as if she could do exactly the same thing with her various light buttons and so on, Cammy also can't jump to the other side of you and command throw immediately.
Round one. Fight.
So there, for example, you see that moment of, wait, which am I supposed to punish with again? And since it is so tiring, you have to end up spending a lot of time figuring out whether or not it's safe to do a particular thing or not. You can't even be sure that you should do reversal, for example. It's what many people would consider a good idea for dealing with her. But this is only easy to deal with if you jump in medium punch. That's basically your only option. You wait for them to poke at you and then you jump medium punch. And that's it. If you have air throw, you probably aren't so susceptible to this. Fortunately for Ryu and most other characters, the designers purposely gave at least a good subset of characters a jumping medium punch that combos into things and does a lot of chain damage and stops situations where this comes up too often. But here's the problem. This isn't someone who doesn't know what they're doing, which means that the situation you're dealing with now is that they've recognized the jumping medium punch is going to happen occasionally and basically slowed down and stopped. See? So they're looking for the moment they can use to redo it, but you can counter-adapt like that. You can counter-adapt by realizing, well, if you want to give that up now, I have more options again. And it's recognizing that you have dispelled the blind and unlocked your own options again that allows you to win. But regardless of anything else, all this blind and cornered is really exhausting, and most people, one of the reasons that the reaction to Mika is generally so strong, in a negative sense, is that being blinded for long periods is often demoralizing. That's the sort of match where even when you look back at it, you're still upset. Because yeah, you might have been able to solve the problem and kill them in like 3 attempts and then shut down the whole game, but you're not really thinking that at the time. Because you're not thinking about winning. You're not thinking about the fact that if you knew the combo or could do enough damage off of the quote-unquote obvious counter, that you just destroy them. You're thinking about the fact that they're doing something annoying and getting away with it. So yes, Amara is also usefully working on stuff she can do with the aforementioned technique of hitting people on their rise with Hadouken. Which is good because Nash Bot has a specific type of recovery that most people, it doesn't really make sense to throw Hadoukens at them when they do it. He uses a lot more back roll than most characters, and the sort of moves that he uses on you generally don't lend themselves to just throwing him and hoping for the best, especially since he has such a tendency to backdash. Generally, your aim should be to go for the hit and work from there.
You are currently ranked top of the South North America.
So, Abigail is an intimidating character for most people, but what exactly makes him so? His defense is good, but only when he's expecting certain things to happen.
Round one.
Abigail's more of a character who's weak to things than a character who's able to easily and strongly put things into those situations for you. Still looks a little silly, but whatever. However, Abigail has an advantage that belongs to Fang and Alex and himself primarily. Range. And range has a big impact on a particular aspect of this game. Having more range than other characters is where Paralyzed comes from. Because the more range your opponent has, the less you can use of your normal buttons and normal ways of trying to clip them and do damage. You can't really use your pressure either. They just get to stand out of the range of everything, which reduces you to trying to get in some way, or having to deal with their motion as well as trying to deal with their long buttons. The good part about this is that most characters who use a lot of quote-unquote paralyzed, that isn't by itself a win condition. They have to paralyze you and then do something else. And if there's something else isn't too strong, they don't necessarily come out on top. So most of them are aiming to cause that effect, and from there, use their meter because they've managed to swing a lot. Not necessarily to hit, but it's easier for them to build up meter hitting your block than most other characters. Even his jumping kick is helpful here because Ryu's parry, while extremely effective against it, doesn't necessarily lead into anything from it. Ryu can't go, okay, I've parried this, now I'm going to do a ton of damage to you. He has some options for that, but they're not very easy to use. So Abigail goes from paralyzed to terror to petrify. It's just a general feeling of, what do? I probably shouldn't hit anything. Ryu is able to just decide, I'm hitting things anyway. And certain other characters have some decent options for him. But that's where Abigail's parry comes in. It's not as if, for example, Chun-Li can just hit stand heavy kick all day. Can just parry. And his armor allows a lot of things, as you can see. So it's a large matter of understanding ranges, understanding your own longest buttons and what you have to play carefully with and play safely with in order to get your advantage as much as you can. And the more confident and aggressive you get, the more effective Abigail's moves become. So he can play neutral until you start getting aggressive with him, and then do more and more moves. As you can see, it gets fairly harsh after a little bit. The key therefore is to try to force Abigail to mistime his own moves. And as you can see, that is not necessarily too hard. A good backdash or overall spacing, when you're expecting a particular thing, means that Abigail's situation changes very quickly. And armor is still just armor. So that sort of thing happens. If you spend too much time paralyzed, Abigail slowly gains advantage. You have to be a little brave at least, most of the time. And from there, attempt to make him mistime stuff afterwards and hope it doesn't turn too bad in your situation. But as you can see, the armor really does make a big difference, and this does turn into a race of damage, which is, I suppose, the entire theme of the character. But it is hard for some people to get used to moves that no one else can generally punish seriously, being things that Abigail just hits you out of in his sleep, basically. His size also makes him extremely good at dealing with people who are in the corner because it's easy to make them feel intimidated while they're there. This is partly why our Abigail bot is so focused around teaching you how and when you can cross him up, and how much it does not have to do with his actual size as a character. Because once you've learned that, it's a lot easier to not be as afraid of him when you get cornered, and recognize he still has to use a lot of moves to solve that situation. For Ryu, it's actually easier to deal with Abigail normally when he's approaching through Tatsu. Not specifically regular Tatsu. Yes, Tatsu is more required for most things, but the good thing is that actual regular heavy Tatsu has specific timing that Abigail just can't deal with sometimes. The player has to be expecting it. So you first act aggressive enough to make them actually pay attention to trying to do moves. And then from there you have probably free reign to occasionally just Tatsu because it'll work. It's also, in Ryu's case, one of his most powerful moves at just punishing stuff. So you'll know that even though the situation looks as if, well, Abigail's been doing most of the damage overwhelming, their life isn't that much different, which is really weird considering that their health isn't that similar. So now we've got them in that aggressive mode, at least in the beginning of that round they were. And understanding how to take that and turn it into, I should do this, I should just Tatsu here, those sort of things, that's super important to get through this matchup as Ryu, and as most other characters who have similar interactions. The main reason being that you have to look for that moment where the Tatsu or whatever else will give you the advantage without them getting to take a lot of damage off of you. Much like that. There's that lull in the action between where they want to do something and where they think you're not going to be ready, where you can just Tatsu them and do that sort of thing.
You win.
So in the end, Amara takes it. But as more and more DLC characters come out and the game actually gains more and more depth, at least at the bronze and up to just before gold tier, you're going to have to try to keep up with the understanding of the characters as a whole, relative to your own. This, like most fighting games, is very matchup related. It's not necessary to understand matchups that well in order to play, but if you want to win consistently, you have to be able to do it. If you're playing for fun and not minding too much who wins matches in the sense of whether or not the reason has to do with your characters, you're fine. You can play to do cooler things, you can play to get used to cool things, you can play to even just see cool things. But as I have a strong suspicion that many of the people who want to play to see cool things are going to drift toward the new Marvel that is out. If you're going to be hanging around in the Street Fighter world, you need to be at least prepared for the increasing complexity of characters, because they're not going to want to make boring characters, even if we do get in Season 3 / Super Street Fighter Sagat and Oro and Sakura,
You are terrific
it's
rank.
unlikely we're going to see exactly those same sorts of players again.
North America.
Now again we're looking at a certainly below 1000 points. That generally means that they have tried to get up by playing more so foot siege than pressure. And that's looking approximately accurate right now. So as I said, you're going to see a lot of spacings and things related to spacings. But once you've gotten over the idea that spacings matter a lot, that she has a lot of options in which you have to worry about moves, because you don't. That's the general idea. When Chun-Li is moving forward enough to attack you, she can only do one move. She has lost all her other options in terms of moves are gone. So it mostly becomes a matter of understanding her ranges. And the Chun-Li player is aiming to keep you as confused about those ranges as possible.
Fight.
You may often find yourself wondering, wait, I thought I could punish that move. But since it has more to do with where she's standing, some moves become less punishable depending on which one of them she does. Some moves become less punishable because she was standing in a different place. Some moves become less punishable because they hit you later into their active frame. A bunch of different things interact to decide whether or not you can easily handle Chun-Li's moves. However, for Ryu, the solution is usually fairly easy. His crouching heavy punch has a deceptively long range, a range that most people will not understand just by playing Ryu and doing it. They'll assume it's shorter than it is. Chun-Li is particularly weak to this move because it whiff punishes a ton of things she does. And it's fast enough to do this as a generality almost. It beats the startup of a ton of things, and similar. Now, unfortunately, it's not really a catch-all solution for her playstyle, but it's just a supplementary thing to go with all your other stuff. And I'll note, for example, it's actually faster than Ryu's crouching medium kick, so you can use it for a lot of things. Plus it tends to make Chun-Li want to do a particular thing in response, and the thing it makes her want to do is usually bad. But there's another example of life. Amara knows from facing me that you can't just do one parry, because you never know for sure whether or not your opponent is going for a 2-hit jump in or 1-hit jump in. And both of them lead to the same combo, so it's not even as if you could say, well, I just won't worry. So being careful is really important. Plus, her moves also hit at different times depending on which one she does, making the parry even harder. As you can tell, it becomes fairly frenetic. Her speed does make constantly reapplying the blind effect relatively easy. and staying calm in the face of it can be quite hard. Now that move is actually something most people can stop, but not all of them, which leads to stuff like this. And I don't believe Amara's ever had enough reason to assume that she had to care about defeating that in that particular way. But that is a different form of effect that Chun-Li can apply. It is her strongest way to apply effectively slow. It is a form of paralyze, but is more so tending towards slow because which effect it has a lot more to do with which character is hitting than which character it's just generally not a thing that you go, Chun-Li does this. She hits you with it, and whether or not it's slowing you or paralyzing you is more so related to which character you're playing. So generally, Ryu wants to say backdash out of that. It may not always lead to anything good, but remember that in order for her to have done the standing punch, she again couldn't have been doing many other moves. She can probably manage to Kikoken, but she can't Kikoken fast enough for you to have to worry about it. With higher execution, she could manage spinning bird kick, but she definitely can't do that in time for it to matter. But there are characters who can't afford to backdash out of that, who will eventually lose out in some other way if they have to consistently decide between backdashing or not. People who are more easily bothered by her other buttons, or who can't really do damage without being close. The other problem is, and many do not know this, if Chun-Li keeps on hitting certain buttons, she moves forward as a consequence of cancelling the recovery. So the thought that, okay, well, I'll eventually get out because she has to stop sometime. No, she doesn't. And since it's such a long-range move, similar to Abigail, just using your V-reversal is probably not going to lead to anything, depending on what your character's V-reversal is. Ryu can basically barely make it sometimes, but then you'd have to decide, am I really willing to use a V-reversal on just a standing heavy punch? It's not a terrible idea though. Ryu's other option is to simply really well time a Super Hadouken. But even this can be iffy.
You are currently ranked conqueror of the South End, North America.
I think we know this, Vega. Either way, the Vega match is one of the more complicated ones. Because Vega's one of those weird characters that has... like, he tends to debuff himself after a while. You don't do anything to Vega to cause stuff to happen. Something happens, and Vega gets under an effect. But knowing what effect Vega is under is still good for you. And you can, with certain characters, at least somewhat set it up. Vega players tend to get flustered when their moves whiff. It makes them take to the air as a general thing. This is because Vega's grounded defense is not good enough to make it worth it. Which seems strange because he has some of the best pulls in the game, but everyone else always seems to have something that's just a little bit better after the whiff of one of his, mainly because the recovery of a lot of his stuff is kind of long. And the more he uses the claw, the longer those recoveries get. So your aim is usually to stand just out of range of anything Vega wants to do, or just walk backward instead of blocking low a lot of the time. And assume that once you've walked backward far enough and say he's whiffed something, a jump is coming. You shouldn't even assume to worry about the next thing. This is because Vega, even though he no longer is a charged character, he's still built as a character that only gets his really good combos from minimum range. This isn't really a property he had before, but rather something that sort of balanced out the way he ended up in this game. So, you don't really have to worry too much about Vega doing things like crouching medium kick into something. And as a result, you have to really let yourself get hit a couple times by the crouching medium kick just so you can feel more comfortable overall.
Round 1. Fight!
But in general, yes, you should be expecting Vega to go into the air like that. So he'll poke, and then he'll jump. It's just the natural flow of the character. Especially with the claw put away, he doesn't really have many good options other than that. Now in that situation, yes, it was bad to get hit with the crouching medium kick, but generally it's not bad enough that you actually care.
Round 2. Fight!
So your main thing to do is look for when he's going into the air because of something else happening. And other than that, Ryu has at least some options in that he can just throw fireballs. He's also good at taking advantage of corners, but most of us have already lived through that many times. So he has to whiff the move first. Note, usually he has to whiff the move first. Because Vega is waiting to see if you will come in at him, so that he can actually use his pokes. And if you refuse to do this, then he has no real strong advantage as a character, other than being able to take you by surprise by changing up his rhythm. He's evasive rather than offensive, for the most part. So for you should generally be working on your ways of dealing with the air to air, because he has too many options when it comes to coming down on you when you're trying to anti-air normally. He can go to the other side, he can make you whiff in a particular way, he can clip you when he's going down regardless of what happens. You're looking for the air-to-air so that you can force Vega to try to hit things early and you can get a better sense of where he's going to be. If you don't air-to-air, then you're usually stuck getting caught up in his air mix-ups, which has been basically how the character has worked for as long as he's existed. That part is not something they're planning to take away from him.
Get ready for action. Another fight is coming your way.
You are currently ranked Conquest of the South King, North America.
Now, as mentioned, Ken is more so two different characters in terms of his effect. Ken's come in two forms. The Ken that moves away from you and either zones or does Tatsu or tries to lure you into it so he can do Tatsu. Sort of like that, but I would expect this from zoning Ken. Even if it takes a little while to get to it, it's similar to the Rasenhan meter that Karine has. He'll eventually build up. They're really just throwing the fireballs that you can make you throw fireballs. They're not throwing fireballs at you so that they're just looking for the moment where they get to do stuff. So Amara could probably stand at the other side of the screen and parry all of these, and it would not matter in one bit. Unfortunately, it's slightly laggy, but you get the idea. And now she has full meter, so she could just like win the fireball war almost automatically, and it won't matter anymore. But now they can't throw them. So, while it may seem like a slow and not particularly great strategy, you have to recognize that the opponent is actually using a slower and even less great strategy. Many of us don't like to play lane, even when our opponent is doing exactly that far more than we are. If this player's idea of winning at Street Fighter is to go back there and throw fireballs, why not just parry every fireball? They're counting on one eventually hitting, but they have a long way to go before that happens. And it's just not in their favor. But here Amara decided to go in anyway. It would have been easier to do nothing about it whatsoever. Because now they don't have the life lead anymore. Now they have to do stuff. Now they have to try to use all that meter, be frustrating, all those things. Eventually though, you can bring them down simply because they don't have a very strong offense. Their plans were built mostly around doing that. Here we go again. Now, the good thing about having a style like this is that it's really easy to figure out what your opponent wants to do about your stuff and get through and basically guard break them based on your own mix-ups. For example, they basically know, oh, this person parries me when I jump in, so I'll just jump in empty. But it's not necessarily enough. Because you'll note that the range they jump from, the way they jump and all those things, leads to being very easy to anti-air anyway. And Ken can't even Tatsu to deal with this situation. So that was all basically because Mara decided, I'm going in, I'm going to actually play more than what I was playing. And our opponent was waiting for that and therefore came out on top. But you'll note that they had no intention of doing anything else. They had no intention of moving toward her at any point. This is just them happening to move forward because the Hadouken game is there. But now she's fighting the uphill battle of getting to do more damage by the time they have finished throwing Hadoukens. And not somehow losing before that. So when you've seen commentators complain that someone has given the game away, this is generally what they're talking about. It's specifically getting into the mindset where you want to play a different game than what your opponent is willing to play. And for whatever reason, their method of playing has the advantage. You can't get to play your way without going through their way, and therefore generally losing. They stand far enough away that Tatsu is basically not going to work. And she can't throw Hadoukens of her own for too long because the opponent will eventually just mess that up with their own Tatsu probably. Right, so now we see the situation has automatically changed. But Amara doesn't really need to build up the V meter to win. It's not the win condition of the fight. It's useful, But she can produce. There's one specific thing that she hasn't necessarily practiced enough that will make it easier to deal with this. The fact that Ryu's standing heavy punch is cancelable in this mode. But doing that now to solve this matchup is not necessarily going to be intuitive enough to just lead to victory. But it is something you could learn as a higher level, just something you could unlock as your own ability later, basically. Basically going, okay, I know how this works, I'm going to win now. But her opponent has basically taken advantage of cornered and some other stuff, and they survive, doesn't look it. So they got greedy, and in their sense, they also gave away the game.
Fight.
So since they're relatively easy to anti-air the other way, the fight starts to become a little lopsided. And you can tell because they went for effectively the Hail Mary Super, which probably wouldn't have hit normally. At full screen is still a little bit unintuitive that you're supposed to throw the second fireball. I'm not actually sure it always works either. But once you've broken their expectation, you can make them flustered enough to take it.
You win. Round one. Fight.
As noted, you should generally expect zoners to do knockdowns or long range low attacks on your wake up because they're expecting you to want to walk away from them. And if you block them, they don't care. So now the opponent is the cornered one. But we already know they're a zoner, they're super relaxed in that situation. It didn't work out for them. But zoners have a tendency to get out of the corner easier against people who aren't very focused on corner guarding. So this match becomes more a match of patience than anything else. You could rate their expectations somewhat by jumping over certain ones, but would it really lead to anything good for you? You have to recognize whether or not you can gain anything from the situation you're in when you're making that decision. So this player has learned, okay, if I do that just before you reach there, then I'll be fine. Not so much. Again, it has to do with giving your opponent far too much time to think about particular things. The more time you give them, the more likely it is that the situation is going to turn away from your favor. Much like that.
You win.
So given that grueling display, that's probably where we're going to end the stream for the night. We did get to see a lot of characters. We got to see a lot of characters that weren't necessarily seen in previous streams on the same topic, or we got to see variations on those characters. Overall, just remember that you are using this way of thinking to add to your understanding of a play. Because what you're aiming to do is to reduce the amount of things you have to think about so that you can play as effectively as possible. Tomorrow we will be giving another bot demonstration, this guidance, using our jury bot. Jury bot has been ready for quite some time, but we were waiting to see what infiltration really did with her when he came back, to see if there was anything that we needed to change about her and any other specific capability we could give her, since, as we all know, when a character shows well at top 8, anyone who wanted to try her out, anyone who wanted to pick up some tech, is going to be trying to at least incorporate some of that stuff into their game. So we had to wait at least somewhat for infiltration to kick it back and show us what exactly Jury is aiming to do. Unfortunately for us, it's basically that his entire top 8 was Rashid, and therefore we only got to see his side of the story and not matchup stuff, but that's enough for us to work with bot-wise. So tune in tomorrow evening at the same time, 7 PM Eastern, for this guidance with Jury Bot, and look forward to her release on Sunday at the usual time. This has been Rillian and Amara. Have a good evening, everyone.